On-the-spot musical improvisation is something that human beings have taken part in and has existed in nearly every period of musical evolution since the medieval ages. Today, many are more familiar with the contemporary music improvisation found primarily in jazz, psychedelia, progressive rock, and certain 20th century contemporary classical music. For myself, one of the more fascinating and exciting aspects of how music has evolved in the 20th century has been the emergence of genres mixing to form new and completely original approaches to modern-day composition. Through doing so, artists can stretch the boundaries of what they play to go outside the lines, stay there if they want to, or go completely out into forays of space and time, with the audience holding on to every inch of their attention for the artists to find their way back again. This creates journeys that the artist invites the listener to embark on, for better or for worse, challenging them to expand the reaches of the musical experience to witness something completely original and cooked up just for them. Welcome back to my continuing That series. Today's focus will be on my connection and deep appreciation for improvisational music in my early years that eventually led to the jam band music scene. A unique niche that asks nothing of the listener except to approach it with an open mind and freewheeling heart. I'll be upfront in saying it does demand your attention, and sometimes patience, to fully get. I feel, though, that for many, and all who, no matter their level of music appreciation, can find beauty, freedom, and a broad spectrum of sounds that will delight the soul and stagger the mind. When I first chose this to be the next topic, and to avoid making a meandering piece about such a broad scene, I chose to limit the number of artists I talk about to the ones who made the most impact on me, and opened my eyes the most to the scene, and to the wonderful people I've met along the way. And for what I'm about to discuss today, everything of value which this scene has provided me could only be absorbed by being fully immersed in the moment. Jazz is the teacher, funk is the preacher. One without the other, you have nothing but the blues. James Blood Ulmer. I started getting formal drum lessons when I was 12 by a great man and teacher named Danny Gorman. He opened and widened my eyes to jazz, but mainly big band jazz. Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Art Blakey. I'd never heard of these cats before. It opened my eyes to how commanding a big band rhythm section is, sitting firmly beneath the towering horn sections. He was partly responsible for me getting my first full-on drum kit, an old Westbury 5-piece he had kicking around. My parents surprised me on my 13th birthday when I came home from school and noticed on top of the phone and answering machine, on that old wooden secretary, a pair of drumsticks and an envelope. The card instructed me to go to the basement, which I did, and had my mind blown with what they had given me. This was a tool to help me truly express myself creatively and push myself to excel at something I had real natural talent for. My formative years on drums consisted primarily of rock and roll and blues that Dad and I used to blast out of our basement. Sultans of Swing, Walk the Dog, Brown Sugar, or even just a 12-bar blues jam were some of our go-to staples that gave me great insight on how to play with other musicians. Every now and then we'd have a third come by and either be on second guitar or the rare bass player who made it a full rhythm section, minus the piano, of course. Those years were crucial in forming my understanding and confidence for performance. I was the youngest to join the jazz band at my high school, Lindsay Place. You usually had to be in grade 9 to join on drums, but I was in there by the start of grade 8. The feel came to me quickly. It was around that time where I started listening to more complex music. Frank Zappa, Weather Report, Return to Forever, and Peter Gabriel era Genesis were so ingrained in me that I would dream the arrangements, feeling the complex pulses rattle and hum through my subconscious. I started tapping out complex rhythms on my desk, making beats with my teeth, and breathing rhythm daily, which continued for many years as my experience grew with my instrument. The first, I guess you could say, jam band that I came across was Dave Matthews Band. The song Stay was the first of theirs I heard, having seen the music video on Much Music, which my sister and I were regularly glued to in those days. Their drummer Carter Beauford instantly blew my mind and quickly became my favorite living drummer at the time. I had never heard drumming that technical in the mainstream of the 90s before. Their concert release, Listener Supported, was on PBS, which I caught one night, and that's where I really saw the jams. Now, they weren't big jams, but they gave me a taste for what a jam band looked and sounded like. A typical jam band, much of their songs will have a fixed composed section, which will most often be played exactly the same every time, with minor variances depending on how they feel that particular night. What makes them a jam band is what they do after those composed sections, which is stretch out the song and rely on certain musicians to carry the mood so the song can be taken for a walk. Therein lies where the magic is born. That creative spark that you can either keep building to a raging fire, or if the vibe isn't there, you cut it loose and move on. Dave Matthews Band certainly had some jam vehicle songs, but it wasn't until a visit to the Point Claire Public Library sometime in 1998 where I truly stepped into knowing what a full-on jam band sounded like. I had seen this name on forums while looking for Dave Matthews bootlegs that were called Fish. While browsing the drawers of CDs they had, I found Fish's only commercially available record at the time, called A Live One. The opening track, Bouncing Around the Room, immediately captured my attention. The crisp, soothing, and warm instrumentation was like butter to my ears. No jams yet, but this was a great start. Then the tune Stash, right after, kicked things up a huge notch. The intricate composition with an unmistakably Latin feel grabbed all of my attention. My ears were right at home with this one. But everything changed when I got to the track, You Enjoy Myself. I had never been so musically turned on since hearing Frank Zappa's record Roxy and Elsewhere for the first time when I was 12. Clocking in at 20 minutes and 57 seconds, this mammoth piece of music took me on a wild adventure of rhythmic sonic delight. The lush, bright piano, the sweeping guitar passes, the wall-thumping bass and wild, wonderful drums left me with one question. Who are these guys, and where can I find more of this? That question didn't really get answered until over a decade later. When I went to Vanier, I got far deeper into jazz and 20th century classical music that I hit the pause button on Fish for a while. I saw my first Dave Matthews Band show in Buffalo, New York in July of 2000 with my dad. Now, having seen a jam band live, I knew the experience of being physically at a show was the way to experience the music. The studio records for a given jam band might be good or even great, but doesn't really cut the mustard when you've been there in person. I saw Dave Matthews a few more times from 2001 to 2003, and continued following them until sadly their multi-horn and woodwind player, Leroy Moore, passed away suddenly. Followed then by their fiddler Boyd Timsley leaving the band. They just didn't really do it for me anymore. Even though I kind of fell off, I still go back and listen to Live at Red Rocks, some old cherished bootlegs I got in my trading days, and recently picked up Before These Crowded Streets on vinyl, which was the first record of theirs I bought and fell in love with. Time went on, as did my musical expeditionary travels through a sea of sounds, experiences, playing in various bands and music projects. 2016 was the year where the scene was revealed to me up close. Every August in Arrington, Virginia, at the Oak Ridge Farm, there's a music festival held called LOCKN. Learning that Fish were going to play on top of the fact that Dad had attended the previous year, where Tedeschi Trucks Band did a huge tribute to Joe Cocker and the Mad Dogs and Englishmen Band, with many of the original members there to perform, and said it was an epic experience. So I knew this was my chance to check out that band I fell in love with all those years ago, but never chased after, in this setting I had never been exposed to before. We drove there in our friend's VW bus, and were going to camp with a large group of friendlies I would come to get to know quite well over the 4 days we were there. Managed to lock down some flour pretty quickly upon arrival. The drinks came out, and it was time to set the controls for the heart of the fun. Fish played the Friday and Sunday 9 o'clock slot. Their shows have always consisted of 2 sets with an intermission between, known as set break. Fish have a hefty songbook filled with their own songs, many of them giant jam vehicles that range in length, as well as some where, out of nowhere, if the mood is right, they might turn it into a jam. The guitarist and singer Trey Anastasio did a senior project at Goddard College, which was The Man Who Stepped In Yesterday, a musical set in the world of Gamehenge. Many of their most well-known songs came from this project, and the entire opus has been performed in its entirety a number of times. Without going too deep into them, and trust me, I could go really deep when talking about Fish. I'll just say that what I knew about them up until seeing them at LOCKN was limited outside of that one live record and their studio record, Billy Breathes. In a lot of ways, I felt like I was going in blind, which suited me perfect because I already knew I was in for a rich night of great music. That feeling quickly disappeared when they opened their first set with Wilson, a song that was on a live one that I knew quite well. After those 4 thuds it opens with, in unison with the whole crowd around me, I let out some huge Wilson chants. It was unbelievable. The rest of the show I heard predominantly stuff I'd never heard, but because it's a festival, the tendency seems to be to put out the most hit-friendly and accessible material, because potentially many in attendance might not be as familiar with the deep cuts. That's not to say there weren't jams, but that's the thing with this music. Even the safe songs have all the steam they need to be able to be carried out into holy epics. I later learned that the band rehearsed in these lengthy sessions, which they called the Okipa ceremonies, where with the help of the flower, sometimes psychedelics, but always with plenty of tea and coffee, they would have an incredibly long discussion of deep musical improvisational consciousness over many hours. They also developed a technique to be able to, in a way, pass the torch around the jam, so everyone lends in laying it all out. The following is an excerpt from the book Fish, the Biography by Park Pewterbraw. Fish's insistence on pushing themselves was evident at these sessions, where they spent considerable time on self-devised listening exercises. The best known was called Including Your Own Hay. These exercises, which formed a large part of their practice regimen from 1990 through to 1995, are not so easy to explain, but important for understanding how Fish could maintain a seemingly telepathic chemistry in concert. The whole idea was to improve the level of collective improvisation by learning to listen to each other while jamming. They do this by conjuring riffs and patterns out of thin air, varying and embellishing them until they were locked in, individually announcing their arrival with the word hey. When they'd each include their own hey, it was on to another round. Hey means we're locked in, explained Anastasio. The idea is, don't play anything complicated, just pick a hole and fill it. They explored different elements of music, tempo, timbre, dynamics, harmonics within the hey regimen. A variation on Including Your Own Hay, which they called Get Out of My Hay Hole, had the cardinal rule that one musician's note could not sustain over anyone else's. The impression the shows left on me was incredibly profound, just with the music itself. But then when I started to learn about their performance philosophy, my third eye to jam bands was opened. Over the next several months I started listening to as much Phish as I could. I'm sure much to the chagrin of some, but I didn't care too much. I was going through something, and it had awoken something in me that I wanted to explore. New Year's Eve 2016, I was able to score a ticket for their show at Madison Square Garden in New York City. They do 4-night New Year's Eve runs that have been going on yearly since 1991, with the exception of when they took a 5-year hiatus in the 2000s. They do 3 sets, with the third consisting of what's known in the scene as a gag, which can be a stunt they pull off by flying through the venue on a hot dog, like they did one year in Boston, or just a theme that they'd riff on, or some sort of meta-nostalgic lens into their own craft over their long career. See, Phish have a particular sense of humor. You can't go so far as to call them a comedy music act, but there's always been a certain comedic whimsy to a lot of what they do. But much of it only exists in the music itself, or the performance being done. They rarely speak to the crowd outside of a few thank yous here and there, and Trey might say a few words here and there, but they aren't up there doing material. That's really what I went into feeling at my first New Year's spent with that scene. We were all in on the joke and were locked into whatever they were going to have on order that night. The gag ended up being a performance of one of my favorite later songs of theirs called Petrichor, in the style of a Broadway musical, with dancers and circus-like performers dangling from high wires. It ended up being quite the spectacle to behold. I had eaten more Phish in the last 4 months than I ever thought I would, even knowing what I knew about the band going into the LOCKN weekend. Over the next several years I saw them 4 more times, 3 of which were the first 3 nights of the Baker's Dozen run, which had them playing 13 shows at Madison Square Garden, never repeating a single song. That's 26 sets of originals and covers, spanning their entire 33-year run up until that point. The 4th show was in Raleigh, North Carolina, which I flew to and went solo, bumping into a few folks I knew from the scene. I was supposed to see them 3 more times during the Curveball Festival they were holding in August of 2018, but it got cancelled due to severe flooding in the area. Luckily, we found out the night before we were all set to take off early the next morning. I was so bummed. Since then, I haven't seen them again. Big reason was the pandemic, but more than that, concert going has gotten insanely expensive, and there doesn't seem to be anything to suggest that's really going to change. Especially when it's a band I need to travel to another country to see. Just isn't as feasible anymore. I know I'll catch them again someday, but if I never see them again, I know I got some incredibly memorable shows, and those memories I'll carry for the rest of my life. Besides Phish, something else happened to me that weekend in Virginia. For the first time in my life, I finally came around to completely loving the Grateful Dead. Phish have followed in that tradition forged by the Dead. They share similarities such as 2 sets, entirely different sets every night, and New Year's show runs. Through hearing various covers of Scarlet Begonia's Into Fire on the Mountain during LOCKN, I turned on real fast. There are a number of ways to look at the Grateful Dead scene. You can see deadheads as free spirit chasers of fine music they can lose themselves in, nutty nutheads who think Jerry Garcia is a god, or strung-out drug heads who are really only there for the molly and good blow.
The deadhead is that person, wherever they turn up in society, that's looking for an adventure in America, you know, something to do that's not like what everybody else does, and a chance to get out and scare themselves a little. We're one of the last frontiers where you can go out and get scared, you know, and have a scary time of it, and maybe have a little trouble, but also find a lot of support and make a lot of friends, and that, you know, so it has its own energy, and they carry on quite nicely even without us. So it's a sub-society of some kind. I don't want to call it a counterculture, because that's not really what it is. It's really an expression of the kind of larger American picture, America as an interesting place to be in.
Not that I haven't indulged in certain things. Heck, I had a couple of balloons walking down NYC on New Year's Eve at 1:30 in the morning on our way to the next bar. But nothing intrigued me about going too deep into any of that stuff. I was always there for the music. With as far back as my passion for true musical expression went, it could not be about the music, first and foremost. Without putting the man on too high a pedestal, which he never would have wished for anyhow, Jerry Garcia's playing is some of the only playing I've ever listened to that's brought me to tears. I've sobbed down streets blasting a ridiculous Stella Blue or a haunting and beautifully grand Dark Star. Jerry played with a depth and beauty that mystified me. Similar to being on a quest to hear the best Fish had to offer, I fell into the same trance with the Dead. Even branching out into adoring Jerry Russo's Almost Dead, otherwise known as J-Rad, with their energetic approach to playing Dead music. All you need is a group of individuals who want to lay the foundation for a lush expanse of creative musical energy. One night in 2003, at the last party held in the Eastern Townships on a little strip of paradise we all called Green Acres. On that deck, we'd shared countless afternoons swimming in the pool growing up as kids. Myself, my rhythm brother, and dear friend on bass, Max, along with a couple guitar players we never met before, had our own pop-up jam band. I get goosebumps thinking about the limits we pushed that night and the scenery we painted for all those people dancing in the field, with 2 bonfires burning high in 2 different places at once. Listening to the Veneta Oregon 72 Dead show, I was launched back to that night. Everyone felt the vibe and went with it. The scene can just happen all around you. All you need is that cocktail of music to let it all happen, and it does. Recently I attended a small bar venue in Montreal where a local Grateful Dead tribute band who'd been around since the 80s were playing. A few times throughout the first set of theirs, I yelled out, "Deal!" which is one of my favorite Dead tunes. Much to my delight, they started it up as their closing song for the first set. Nobody had been up to dance since the show started, so up I sprung, ready to tear up a rug and get down with my bad self. In my freewheeling, frenetic foot frenzy, my caseless phone flew out of my pocket, which I proceeded to unknowingly dance all over. Maybe a social comment on the moment, but alas, it was just something that happened. No regrets whatsoever. I danced the shit out of that deal. That feeling of belonging and sharing in the groove is what makes the scene so appealing to me. When you share so many common fibers with people, it allows you to express yourself and tear down your own insecurities, revealing your unfiltered self, clinging desperately to those things the day-to-day doesn't allow for or allot time to. It's primal and not conducive to modernity. The scene is always waiting, though, waiting to herd you back in, to bring you into those feelings, those musicians, those melodies, those people, those experiences, and that pulse that keeps yours in check, reminding you of a time you danced all over your phone and didn't give a care in the world about it because you needed to dance to Deal. The swaths of people who flooded to this scene without $1 million promotional backing or big corporate money lining the situation They are the fuel that keeps it all going. As long as human beings yearn to go outside the lines, hanging off the fringes of form, this scene will surely endure.
Don't you let that deal